So SG, you can start.
Right. Well, dear friends, distinguished guests, colleagues, I am delighted to launch the 2021 Regional Outlook addressing COVID-19 and moving to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the world's still grappling with the effects of COVID-19. Recently, the milestone of 3 million deaths was sadly surpassed. The economic impact has also been brutal. We're listening to your typing, so maybe if you can block, good. Last year, the global GDP shrunk. It fell by 3.5%. And although this year we think it's going to be 5.6% growth, maybe 2022, 4%. So we think it's going to move in the right direction, but the recovery will be uneven, and many countries will take several years to regain their pre-crisis dynamism. Now, the COVID-19 crisis has revealed how vulnerable our world can be and how quickly shocks can threaten our societies, our communities, our lives. From the outset, plece was central to COVID-19 spread. In urban areas, physical proximity facilitated rapid transmission, but broader place-based factors like housing conditions also mattered. Poorer places with crowded living and working conditions were among those hardest hit. And this is why many governments adopted a place-based approach to address the immediate health impact of COVID-19. For example, Australia, Canada, Colombia, France, Italy, they all adopted measures for specific localities and regions to target what we could call the virus hotspots. Now, the economic impacts of COVID-19 have also varied enormously across places. In 2020, employment at risk from lockdown varied from less than 15% to over 35% across regions, driven in part by the location of the strongly hit sectors like tourism, hospitality, retail, culture, services in general. Again, economic action has often been locally targeted. For example, 30% of subnational governments in the European Union provided large direct support to businesses and to the self-employed. Now, as we look to recover from COVID-19, the 2021 Regional Outlook reminds us that a coordinated, place-based approach will be vital to address future global challenges. In particular, our report shows the urgent need to deploy place-based policies to tackle the long-term crises around the corner. Which are they? Well, climate change, biodiversity loss, environmental degradation. That's happening as we speak. Now, allow me to outline some key reasons of why we have to focus on these variables. First, the COVID-19 pandemic has again highlighted the importance of the environment. Now, it has to do with the environment and other domains. For example, the spread of diseases. What does the environment have to do with the spread of diseases? Well, land use change, biodiversity loss heightens the risks of new pandemics emerging regionally when appropriate measures are not implemented. Second, the effects of climate change are rapidly intensifying. As a result, the number of recorded extreme weather events has tripled in the last 4 decades. Places must be equipped with the right policies to deal with these events, because we know they're going to be more frequent. And third, the cost of addressing these environmental emergencies will affect some places more than others, as our report shows. While overall employment losses from the transition to climate neutrality are small, at the local level, they can have potentially devastating economic effects. So local measures will be key to ensuring what we call a just transition. That means a transition that is fair, that is balanced in terms of the impact it has on the different groups. Given that local governments are in charge of 64% of public investment in sectors that directly impact climate change and other environmental issues, they are in a unique position to act. 64% of investment. In this context, the OECD's new International Program for Action on Climate, so-called IPAC, could help ensure that urban and regional measures are aligned with national policies in the collective fight to tackle climate change and to deliver on net zero emissions at the latest by 2050. And local action will also bring local benefits. Our report shows that bold, decisive action can actually create local jobs. For example, for every €1 million spent to boost energy efficiency in buildings, well, that will create about 27 jobs during 1 year. So local climate policies and local climate initiatives can also help to reduce air pollution in rural, urban areas, facilitate mobility, and improve the health of the local residents. So, dear friends, this year the world has an opportunity to take a huge step forward to address environmental emergencies. The recent US Climate Summit has confirmed a strong global commitment to stop global warming, to protect our fragile ecosystems, and to safeguard the life on this planet. I always say that our most immediate duty is to beat the virus, to beat the pandemic, but that our single most important intergenerational responsibility is to protect the planet. our 2021 regional outlook is a powerful reminder of how effective place-based policies can contribute to this global effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. I mean, we are very glad to have you with us this morning. We're very honored, and thank you for this really inspiring speech. I think you have very vividly painted the risks our planet is facing, and how important it is that we have place-based and strong policy solutions to deal with them. So thank you very much. That was really excellent start into this session. And I hope you can stay a bit longer with us. I'll pass the floor now to Lamia Kamal-Shawi, who will present the main findings from the report.
Thank you very much, SG. For the first things I'd like to do is to do something that you always do, Secretary General. I don't know if you please, Nicolina, let me have this moment, and yes, so that I can show to the participants the cover of the report, because in general it's always the Secretary General that is doing that, and it just arrived. So thank you so much, SG, distinguished panelists, delegates of the RDPC, the Regional Development Policy Committee, dear Flavia, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. The Secretary General just set out the report's key messages, and what I want to do is to deep dive into some of them with a few maps and figures and a couple of key policy messages. So now, Nicolina, I think you can share. Yes, thank you so much. You have already go to the next slide. So what I'm going to do is to tell you to dive into some of these messages, showing you a few maps and figures, a couple of messages. And this particular edition of the Regional Outlook is the 6th edition of this biannual publication, which is the flagship of the RDPC. And we chose to structure it into 2 parts. The first part focuses on how different regions have fared during the COVID-19 crisis, and our data and analysis actually documents the different spatial impact of the crisis within countries. And the second part of this edition looks ahead to engaging regions in the transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And as the Secretary General set out very well and clearly in his intervention, these 2 topics are clearly related. They are not at all distinct. The pandemic, of course, has highlighted the importance of the environment to our economic and social lives by showing us how human interactions with nature can unleash deadly diseases and outcomes. So it is fitting that the second part of our report focuses on climate change and meeting the bold but essential target of net zero emissions. And as the report set out, both in rising to the challenge of the pandemic and net zero emission, local action can really make all the difference. So please, Nicolina, next slide. Thank you so much. Let me first talk about the spatial impacts of the pandemic. And it's becoming very clear that COVID-19 is working to reinforce existing territorial inequalities or even exacerbate them. We know that people living in poorer areas, in crowded living conditions, and who could not telework, they were hit particularly hard, and they are still, by the way. This left deprived urban areas in many countries prone to much higher infection rates, while job losses hit the low-paid residents hardest. But also rural areas, many of them prove particularly vulnerable due to the larger shares of older residents, more limited access to health infrastructure, and low shares of jobs amenable to remote working. And the map on the slide that you can see here, it shows clearly the significant regional differences in terms of the share of jobs at risk from lockdown, and we have been collecting the data since the beginning of the crisis. This measure in particular looks at the share of employment in each place in what we call high risk sectors, with red indicating places where the greatest share of jobs at risk. In most regions, for instance, accommodation and food, wholesales and retail, as well as art and entertainment account for most jobs in occupations at risk. In terms of regional differences, it showed that the share of jobs at risk from lockdown can exceed 35% in some tourist destinations. We have seen that in southern European islands, in Korean islands, but also in some highly interconnected, dense locations. And here you can see the case of Japan, for instance. In United States, again, this is another interesting outlier there. Nevada stand out as having the highest share of jobs at risk on account of tourism too. Please, next slide. So the report shows how governments at all levels have taken unprecedented action to contain the spread of COVID-19 and help mitigate the economic impacts. And we saw that in many countries, national governments have had to act fast and first to set the strategy and approach. But as the crisis evolved, subnational governments have been also able to react at speed, targeting, tailoring, and adapting their responses to specific local needs and coordinating action across multiple policy domains. Many subnational governments have put in place measures to protect the vulnerable, providing emergency financial support, as well as food, medication, and housing. And we have seen cities like Montreal, Paris, Berlin, Washington, DC, having taken what we would call no regrets measures that support the pandemic response, but also help better prepare for a climate neutral economy, for instance, by enabling social distancing through the extension of terraces on sidewalks and pedestrianization of streets, or by increasing bike lanes. And by the way, we are going to experiment that in 1 week in Paris. Good data and clear, rapid communication was crucial for many cities and regions to take action. This was very important. And for example, Mexico City, Budapest, they have used data to observe collective density and mobility patterns, while in Daegu, Korea, the Smart City Data Hub helped to trace patient routes and identify potential infection. And the pandemic has also highlighted the importance of expert advice in managing risk and anticipating needs. And here we can say that not all regions and cities, they had this capacity. They are not all very well equipped. It has also highlighted the importance of timely upgrades to infrastructure, given how important digital and health infrastructure has proved during the crisis, and how governments struggled to meet demand in many regions. So overall, all these place-based action have been a critical but often less celebrated part of the global crisis response. And we strongly believe they should be a key part of the economic recovery. This is really a key message that we wanted to bring to the attention of national government, to our constituency. And it is essential for national recovery strategies to include an explicit territorial dimension. And it's actually very encouraging to see that many countries across the EU, but also including Australia, Canada, Korea, United Kingdom, and the United States, they have done so in their recovery strategies. Next slide, please. Let me now talk specifically about the question of the environment, which is the focus of the second part of the report. As we know, more and more OECD countries are now aiming for net zero domestic greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Meeting this challenge, of course, requires major structural changes, but again, with far-reaching implication for different types of regions. And as the map here shows, there is huge variation in the level of emissions between places. And it shows estimated here, specifically, estimated greenhouse gas emissions in tons of CO2 equivalents emitted in each region per capita. And as you can see, emissions per capita are among the highest in some central and northern regions, for instance, of Canada, the US, and Australia, as well as in a few regions across Europe or New Zealand. We can see also that in many regions of Latin America, South and Western Europe, estimated emissions per capita are more than 5 times lower. There is a similarly huge variation in terms of the number of jobs at risk from the transition to zero net carbon emission. So while on average, only 2.3% of employment in OECD countries in sectors at risk of some employment losses from climate policy over the next 2 decades, actually that figure is more than 6% in some areas such as Salicja in Poland or Gyeongdam region in Korea. We have really to pay attention to that. This means we should not really underestimate the potential economic and social impact of the green transition in some specific regions. Next slide, please. So region with countries, actually they face different, within countries, they face different challenges when it comes to transitioning to net zero emission. This is a key area of work of the RDPC. Across the OECD, for instance, we have seen that metropolitan region contribute much more in total emission than rural region, especially in North America and OECD Asia. And the chart here on the screen show that the sources of emission differ among countries, but also among regions within countries. And in North American metropolitan region, we see that transport emission per capita, they are particularly high, while in OECD Asia, energy emissions dominate. The transition to net zero carbon emission raises challenges, but also we have to remind that it can also present huge opportunities for some places. I give you an example, rural areas, they can particularly gain from investment in renewable energy. This is not a new idea. The chart on the screen on the right part show that rural areas have the largest potential for generation from renewable sources. And actually the RDPC, the committee, has been long working on this issue. And we had a previous work on linking renewable energy to rural development, showing really the tremendous opportunities that were seized by a number of rural regions. This is something that today becomes even more important to look at and address and encourage. Actually, the benefits of this will only be realized through the right policy action. We have seen that in many of our case studies. And this includes, for instance, complementary investment to support skills, innovation, and local supply chain. Next slide, please. So tackling these challenges requires regional action because of the differences in challenges and opportunities, but also because we have to remember something that, you know, in many parts, in different parts of the government, we tend to forget that OECD subnational governments are actually on average responsible for 64% of public investment related to climate change and other environmental issues. So they have a key role to play just because of their prerogative. Moreover, we have also to remind that local actors, they are extremely motivated, not just by the global imperative they are, but also by much more local and immediate benefits to residents, benefits that we cannot always see at national level, but we can really see clearly at the local level, such as, for instance, improve air quality. But local action needs to be supported by good multi-level governance and finance too, to provide the right resources and incentives to make the transition. Metropolitan region, we need to make, for instance, consumption more consistent with net zero emissions. For example, by eliminating food waste and encouraging sharing and reuse of goods. And rural areas, we need to make the most of their potential for renewable energy, for instance. But let me tell you, but critically and very importantly, we need to take steps to ensure what everybody is talking about that today, the just transition, to really avoid regional decline through job losses and the immigration of businesses and workers for some particular region. This is essential, and this and here, of course, regional policies place-based approach matter. It cannot be just, you know, a top-down uniform approach. National governments should work to identify the local areas that are most at risk and think about how regional policy can help in smoothing this transition. And to achieve this, regional policymakers need to build consensus and actions to develop new industrial pathway with local partners from higher education institutions, from, of course, local government, businesses, and all actors in the communities. And policy makers at all levels should seek to embed inclusiveness in all climate policy decision, which of course requires involving communities and local actors in this decision making process. At CFE, in the OECD, in the Regional Development Policy Committee, we have been working on this issue for a very long time. But now we are exploring the just transition specific angle further with the European Commission. We are going shortly start a new work looking at how the deep decarbonization of industry will affect regions and their workers, and helping policymakers identify how and where they need to provide additional support. Last slide, please. The pandemic has been an important and tragic reminder of how vulnerable our lives and livelihoods can be to changes in our natural environment. And it has also shown that all levels of government are capable of bold, decisive, and often innovative action to respond to these threats and protect, of course, the vulnerable. In the years to come, we need to respond to the climate challenges at all levels with the same level of urgency. And this is something that the Secretary General made it very clear in his intervention. But we, of course, to do that, we need to have the right institutions. Local partners will remain on the front line, saving lives and livelihoods once more. So we really need to count on them. So I will stop here. The last word that I will say is, of course, I would like to thank my team, Rudiger, Aaron, head of the economic analysis, data and statistics in CFE, the main author of the report, Andres Fuentes and Julian Knowles, who did the quantitative analysis, as well as all the other contributions in CFE. There are many, because of course this type of flagship mobilizes all of the different type of expertise, and of course all the delegates in the RDPC. So now I understand nobody was able to see the cover of the report. So I hope that this time it's going to work. It depends also, you know, about, yes, this time. Can you see it? It's quite difficult when you have some background, but of course it's now on the OECD library, so you can have access on the website. Thank you so much. Again, Secretary General, I see that Simon has just joined us.
Let me just say, Lamia, I understand that today is Simon Upton's wedding anniversary, right? That you are celebrating your wedding anniversary. So let me send you a big hug, but most importantly, your wife a big hug for her resistance. Hein? Hey,
so, résistance de 37 années, 37 années.
Hey, really big congratulations. Huh? Okay, Lamia, so we go Rudiger.
So Rudiger, yeah, thank you so much, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lamia, for this really very good presentation. So we are now coming to the panel phase of this launch. So we will be kind of like go in depth on certain topics that are raised in the report with the speakers we're having here, which I will introduce you shortly. I just wanted to say that we'll have several rounds, and at some point we'll also have a question and answer session. So people in the public are encouraged to put questions in the Q&A button that you're having on the bottom on the lower part of your screen. And you can also kind of like, when you see questions, you can like them, and then they basically get voted up. And then I will kind of like, I mean, then try to pick the most important, most popular questions and then ask them to the panelists as much as time will permit, obviously. So we We will start with Councillor Stein Kakelberg. I'm extremely grateful that you managed to join us because, I mean, you have basically within minutes been able to replace Minister Suhal Demir. She had a last-minute emergency, so she couldn't come. But we're very happy to have you. So you are from the region of Flanders in Belgium, where Minister Suhal is Minister for Environment, Justice, Tourism, and Energy, and you're basically here today for the environmental part mainly. And I wanted to start asking you basically, what do you think? I mean, we are looking a lot at the sub-national dimension in the report about the transition to net zero, and to make this more concrete, I would like to ask you to tell us about the actions that Flanders is undertaking to reach the 2050 net zero greenhouse gas emissions.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, our actions in Flanders towards this 2050 net zero greenhouse gas emission objective. We adopted in 2019 already a strategy on how to go towards this 2050 target with a clear vision and a specific target for each sector. However, in Flanders, we don't envisage net zero greenhouse gas emissions in Flanders itself by 2050. We only aim to reduce our emissions by 85% compared to 2005. However, we hope to attain net zero emissions as soon as possible. This is, of course, our ambition, but we don't think it's realistic to become net zero already by 2050 in Flanders. For some sectors like transport or the power sector, of course, our ambition is to become climate neutral by 2050, but we should be aware that not every region has the same potential in order to achieve net zero by 2050 for the whole economy. For example, Flanders has an important energy-intensive industry, where some industrial processes are difficult to decarbonize in the short term. The same can be said about our agricultural sector, which is also very important in Flanders. And at the same time, we are a highly urbanized region with very limited potential for geographical permanent storage of carbon dioxide. So that just to indicate that we need to take into account these differences between regions. Now, the long-term strategies and the goals, these are important to have an idea about the way forward. But even more important, of course, are the concrete measures that we implement and that we take. And this is what we are really focusing on in Flanders. For example, for the building sector, we also developed a specific renovation strategy with lots of specific concrete measures to get towards these long-term ambition targets. And about the specific measures, we have a few examples. We have, of course, also a recovery plan in the context of COVID-19 recovery. And there we foresee a lot of additional financial resources for these building sectors to improve and to increase this renovation rate, which is very important. We also foresee interest-free energy loans for citizens. And for the non-residential building, we have a mandatory renovation when there is a transfer of such a building. So we really try to focus on these concrete measures to get forward with this ambition.
Thanks a lot, Stein. I'll now turn to the second panelist, Simon Upton. So it's really my pleasure to have Simon with us today. As you just heard, I mean, he's really making an effort to be with us today, so we are particularly grateful for him. He has degrees in English literature, music, and law. I didn't know that, so I didn't know how polyvalent you are. So and especially you have a very distinguished career in New Zealand and France, where among many other positions you have been a long-standing member of Parliament in New Zealand. You have been a Minister of Environment. You've been the OECD chair of the Roundtable on Sustainable Development. And last but not least, you have been director of the OECD Environment Directorate. And now you are the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment in New Zealand. I also wanted to stress that you're not speaking for the New Zealand government or for New Zealand. You're an independent watchdog and you're appointed by the parliament, and your powers are purely advisory. Now, with this disclaimers, I wanted to come to what Stin has been saying. I mean, basically, I mean, they will not be reaching, a full offset. No, they will not be reaching, the full zero emissions by 2050. So that in a way makes also the question of offsets much more important. And in that respect, there's a use of afforestation to basically achieve offsets. And for example, in New Zealand, you allow to offset industrial and transport emissions via afforestation. And I wanted to hear from you about possible regional impacts that such national policies that encourage afforestation may have.
Thank you, Rudiger. And that's, I think, an extremely interesting question, because the idea of offsets is, I think, much more controversial than people realize. And I've changed my mind on this subject over the last 20 years. New Zealand is unique, actually, in allowing unlimited surrender of forest units in the ETS. And so you can emit carbon dioxide today, which will be in the atmosphere for thousands of years. You can plant trees, which, you know, we can manage them for 25, 75, 150 years, but they won't be there forever. This is an interesting point, that agricultural emissions, which are not fossil, they're part of the current carbon cycle. Agricultural emissions have a shorter life, but they're still going to be there for a while. But if you allow offsetting through forestry for the industrial side, what you do is potentially cover large areas of your countryside with trees. Now, it doesn't matter where a cow is standing or where a sheep is standing, the methane and nitrous oxide they're responsible for is the same. So it makes perfectly good sense to have, say, a levy, and this is being debated in New Zealand now. Should we have a levy on livestock? And this is contentious, believe me, but you'd have it the same everywhere. But if you have forestry as an offset, you don't plant trees everywhere. Trees grow in particular places. And so one of the real problems about using forestry as an offset in a country like mine is that you may well end up with the forestry being concentrated in places where, in fact, the results are very regional and very specific. Sure, you're helping the global externality of your emissions, but the trees are concentrated in places. That has a cost, potentially, in terms of jobs and society. You could see depopulation. Even more seriously, if those trees end up being planted in places which are going to become drier, hotter, you could end up actually losing them through fire or disease. Climate change itself could make the terrain less friendly for your offset. So I think this regional perspective is actually very interesting and very useful. We have to be sure that policies taken at a central level, which have a global positive consequence, don't end up, in a biological sense, concentrating risks in particular regions. And that's something that I'm looking at right now.
Thank you very much, Simon. I mean, that's a really interesting view, which is also kind of like has the merit of being relatively new to the debate. But I mean, it's certainly extremely pertinent, and we will clearly keep this into our consideration in our work going forward. So now I'm coming to Nick Godfrey, who is the director of CUT, which is the Coalition for Urban Transitions, and which basically is a special initiative of the new climate economy. And it is the leading global initiative supporting national governments to unlock the economic power of inclusive zero carbon cities. And the coalition is comprised of 36 diverse stakeholders across 5 continents, and including the OECD, and it also has a number of ambassadors. And I'm very pleased, I mean, Ange Guria is one of the ambassadors of the Coalition of Urban Transitions. And so Nick, I mean, obviously, I'm going to ask you some questions on cities because I mean that's what obviously the coalition is for. And in that respect, I mean, we have been touching on the question of emissions, of offsets, and then there also is the question of mitigation and adaptation, and that's particularly relevant for cities because there's large numbers of population living there, and they're obviously both very important. And I would like to hear your thoughts on those two measures, and especially whether you see synergies between them, or if cities are setting certain priorities between them, and what you think about that.
Great. Great question, Rudiger, and wonderful to be with you all. Congratulations on the report as well. It's absolutely terrific, and we wholeheartedly embrace and welcome the findings. A great question. So in our view, the question of resilience and mitigation, building resilience and adapting to climate change, in our view, is equally as urgent as decarbonisation. We recently completed a major flagship report called Seizing the Urban Opportunity, where we looked at urbanisation and the extent to which it could contribute to economic, social and climate goals in 6 countries, including Mexico and 5 other emerging markets. And that work really showed that climate risks are immediate, they're severe, and they're especially pertinent for the urban poor across many countries globally. Climate-related disasters are on the rise, particularly severe storms and floods. And urban areas with, of course, their concentrations of people and property are disproportionately affected. So just to give you a sense, the scale, monsoon floods in China between June and September 2020 caused an estimated $35 billion in damage costs. Our analysis shows that many cities globally are threatened deeply by sea level rise and a range of other climate-related risks. So just to give an example, 194 million people in China live in coastal zones less than 10 meters above sea level. 92% of them are based in urban areas. In Indonesia, 57.7 million people live in low-lying coastal zones. 82% of them live in fast-growing urban areas. And the picture is repeated. In Brazil, in India, Kolkata, home to 15 million people, is already facing much more frequent flooding, and by 2050, much of the city could lie in the annual coastal flood risk zone. So, in our view, it's absolutely critical to embed climate resilience in all urban infrastructure investments, in building standards, in urban revitalization programs. Governments simply cannot afford to spend precious public funds on assets that may become stranded due to sea level rise, frequent floods, major changes in precipitation, and other climate-related hazards. So in our view, this is absolutely critical to look at climate resilience and mitigation when it comes to the urban question. What I would say is that what's really interesting is building resilience can also contribute to reducing carbon emissions. So there's many investments which not only enhance resilience, not only reduce carbon emissions, but also support long-term prosperity. So nature-based solutions, fantastic example of that. Restoring and protecting mangroves near coastal cities from Brazil to India to China would reduce those cities' vulnerability to storms by providing natural buffers and also boost carbon storage. So there's many opportunities to build urban resilience and reduce emissions in all of the world's cities at the same time. So I hope that addresses your question, Rudiger, but I'm happy to say a bit more about that if useful.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it does. But I mean, you've been talking a lot about India and China and Brazil and other, emerging economies. And I think that, and I also saw you have been undertaking some interesting studies on non-OECD countries recently at the coalition. And I was wondering, what do you think are the insights from this work about those countries that can form OECD policymakers in the net zero transition?
Yeah, great, Rudiger. Well, we recently produced a major flagship report supported by the OECD called Seizing the Urban Opportunity. And we looked at how China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, and South Africa could really look to seize the urban opportunity to support economic, social, and climate goals at the same time. And what that report showed is that it is indeed possible, based on currently available technologies and practices, through major investments in buildings, in transport, in urban energy systems, to reduce emissions in cities across all of those 6 countries by close to net zero by mid-century. And that's based on currently available technologies. That's technologies and practices that are available today. The even better news is that these types of investments unleash potentially significant economic benefits. So across these 6 countries, which represent around 1/3 of global GDP and over 40% of the world's urban population, we've shown that investments across those sectors could yield a direct economic dividend in the order of $12 trillion by mid-century and create 30 million new jobs. So the Secretary General and Lamia talked about the job prerogative in the context of post-COVID recovery. And we think there's an opportunity to invest in urban areas to not only reduce emissions, but also create a substantive number of new jobs. And these findings for these 6 countries are absolutely, in our view, can be replicated across many of the countries in the OECD. We've got good findings for Mexico, but also our work shown that these can be replicated. What I'd also say, a final word, is that we found through our work, there's many, many inspiring examples of action to transform cities in non-OECD countries, which we think can be very inspiring for many OECD member countries. To give a few examples, so Indian cities, as with many around the world and in the OECD, are economic powerhouses rapidly growing. The national government has put in place a climate smart cities assessment framework launched in 2019 to allow all of its cities to assess their own vulnerabilities and identify major investments to transform emissions. And India has an ambitious program to mobilize up to $2 trillion in public and private financing to finance the national infrastructure pipeline. Linking this to the climate smart cities assessment framework could be transformative, and I think is very inspiring for many countries world over. Brazil, widely recognized for urban innovation, Curitiba pioneered bus rapid transport in 1974. Now it's available in 21 Brazilian cities and metro areas, carries over 10 million passengers daily. And Brazil has a Ministry of Cities as well, which helps to coordinate investment across the urban realm. So I think that can be a very powerful mechanism. And finally, a word on China. I think China's been making pretty significant strides to address its environmental challenges. Xi Jinping laying out a vision for an ecological civilization, and has really embraced things like nature-based solutions to build urban resilience more recently with its pioneering Sponge City program and commitments to peak emissions well ahead of 2030, and we hope in many of its urban areas. So Rudiger, we think there's many examples from the work that we've done that can be very inspiring for OECD countries in terms of national strategies for cities, and very much welcome the recommendation of this report to place an emphasis on really strong national urban policies. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Nick. Simon, I mean, Nick has been mentioning, for example, the public transport, which is a typical example where you can have co-benefits because you can reduce carbon emissions and you can also improve not public transport as such, but also the quality of the air. And in our report, we're highlighting that climate policies more generally can help address other environmental problems, and that these co-benefits are typically strongest at the local level. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, what is the best way how we can use climate policies to exploit such co-benefits? And maybe you could use water quality as an example. I mean, that's an important issue in New Zealand, but it's also an important issue in many other countries, obviously.
Yes, well, let me just say at the outset that it's very important to ensure that you don't get misalignment between one policy and another. And when I was speaking earlier, I was expressing the concern that whilst you have a fossil problem, and that may be from the cities and the roads and industry, don't think that you can just use biological material to solve it, because A, it's not a fair match, and B, that the biological material trees on the landscape, treating the landscape, if you like, as a place to dump your industrial waste, I think is a short-sighted policy. There's only one solution on fossil fuel, and that's to eliminate it. I'm sorry, but that is what's got to happen. We have to move right away from fossil fuel. But when it comes to biological emissions, we can't move away 100%. We need to reduce them, and we need to find a way of offsetting them. So treating the biological world as a bubble, if you like, seeing the emissions and the sinks as part of a connected system. Now that can make some sense. And I think that one of the, again, I come back to the proposal which is being very intensely debated here, should there be a levy on agricultural emissions? My feeling is that that's a difficult thing to sell politically, but if you said that the levy was going to be hypothecated 100% to go back to helping other environmental problems which are happening in the same landscape that's producing the emissions, then I think you could mobilize communities more easily. Now, when I look at my own country, the most immediate problem in rural areas is actually not climate, at least not in the minds of people. It may actually be the most existential problem, but the thing which is really focusing people is water quality, as you say. And water quality is critical for both for drinking water, for recreational purposes, for environmental quality. Now, if you are asking people to clean up their act, to use the land and the water in a much more sustainable way, that transition will cost money. That transition is an expensive thing. Where does that money come from? Now, if on the one hand, you are asking people to pay for the cost of some of their emissions, and you're asking them to clean up their water, to reduce their erosion, to improve their biodiversity, this potentially becomes an extremely expensive and frightening bill. So I think looking for mechanisms to recycle the revenue we take from economic instruments, and the OECD has always been a good supporter of those very clear incentives, using a price on carbon, price on emissions, but then using the resources to help people make that transition. And in the rural area, I can tell you, that is actually, I think, going to be critical. You have to link the two sides of the equation. And you have to do it, if I may finish on this point, in a way that leaves the landscape more resilient to climate change itself. Because one of the risks is that we simply try to harden up the environment to cope. I don't think we'll win that battle. We need a landscape which can absorb the rain, which can cope with greater heat or cope with greater drought. And that's a much more sophisticated and much more nuanced approach. So everything that we do in climate mitigation has to contribute to climate adaptation. And I think the people who work on the land, farmers, actually understand both sides of that equation. They need to be incentivized to put it all together.
Thanks, Simon. I mean, that's extremely interesting, and I mean, we also very much, I mean, supporting the notion, as Lamia just said, of a just transition, and that we need to really understand well which are the places and the sectors, and that's obviously is connected, that are, I mean, most strongly affected, and how we can either kind of like phase them out, or in some other sectors kind of like help them to transition to production technologies which are compatible with zero net carbon, basically. Sten, I wanted to come back to you, because there's also, I mean, the question of coordination, which we think is very important in the net zero carbon transition, and we are making that point a lot in the report. And what we have seen during the COVID crisis is that on the one hand, I mean, those countries and regions where coordination worked relatively well between different levels of government have been more successful in getting through the crisis. And we've also been seeing a lot of reforms and a lot of improvements or tried improvements to coordination structures across levels of government. And I just wanted to ask you, I mean, how are you seeing the coordination of actions across levels of government. And that goes in our context here in Europe from the EU over the national, regional to the local level. And I mean, specifically in the context of the transition to the net zero. And also in that context, I mean, what are the lessons on the needs for coordination and such coordination structures that can be learned from the COVID crisis?
Yes, thank you, Rudiger, for asking me this question, because of course in Belgium we have a relative complex government structure, so we can certainly acknowledge that a good coordination across the different levels is indeed very important to have an effective policy on all matters, but also especially on climate change, because in Belgium the competences on climate change issues are really divided between the regional levels and the federal level. So we have a lot of coordination structures where we often meet with our colleagues from the federal level and the other regions, and this works in practice quite good. But when it comes to climate change, of course, we need really action and concrete measures at all the different levels to meet our climate goals. And on this aspect, subsidiarity is from our point of view an important element to take into account. So some measures are of course best undertaken at the European level, like for example the European emission trading scheme for the large industrial installations, emission standards for cars. It wouldn't make any sense to take such measures to the regional or national level. So the European level is very important in these aspects, but it needs to be supplemented, of course, by national and subnational actions. So as I said, in Belgium, the regions have many competence on climate change elements. For example, in agriculture, industry, building sector, transport, these are for a big part all regional competences. So we really acknowledge this role, this important role for the regional level in the action against climate change. This is also why our minister accepted to be vice president for Regions 4. This is a global network of regional governments in the field of sustainable development, climate change, and biodiversity. Regions 4 tries to be a global voice of these regional governments in the context of UN negotiations, European Union initiatives, and global discussions in the field of climate change. So indeed, this regional level is very important, and of course, also the local level, of course, the local governments. These are the closest to the citizens, and they will play a very important role in the climate and energy transition. That's why we decided in Flanders to support this local level as much as possible, because although they are the closest to the citizen, sometimes they lack the people and the knowledge to really translate their ambitions into concrete actions, and that's why we started some kind of a help desk for local governments on climate change, where these local governments can ask for practical assistance and knowledge. We also stimulate them to share their best practices with other local governments. So indeed, all the levels are important, and also the regional and then the local levels.
And thanks a lot, Sten. And I was also wondering, I mean, I was in the panel the other day where there was a lady from northern Sweden, and she was telling us about, I mean, their plans of, because they're having a lot of energy which is produced in carbon-free ways. And she was telling us about the plans to kind of like, I mean, become a major carbon-free steel producer, because I mean that typically you do in places where you have this kind of environmentally good energy. And so I mean my point being is kind of like in any change, obviously there's a lot of risk and there's places that are losing or sectors that are losing, but there's also lots of opportunities. And to kind of like put a bit more of a positive spin on this discussion, kind of like what opportunities are you seeing for your region in this transition?
yeah, of course, we try to grasp the opportunities that arise, and we heard already a few times the example of the building sector, that investments in energy efficiency and the renovation of buildings, it will create a lot of additional workforces, and is a real job opportunity. I can only agree with this, of course, but there are also barriers at this aspect. Especially in Flanders, we face a real lack of skilled workers to do these renovations. So this is something we also try to tackle. We are sitting together with the education sector, the sector concerned, to see how we can solve this problem, and that we can find more people that are that become skilled and can perform these renovations. And of course, in the aspect of innovation, we see a lot of opportunities for this, also in our recovery plan.
You're freezing, Steen. You're frozen. Maybe we'll move on, and when you can come back, I mean, maybe you need to log out and log in again. I don't know. Then you can continue. In the meantime, we're now moving to the question and answer session. I would like to start with two questions to Simon that have been coming in here. And the first one is basically on how to support fossil fuel producer regions. And national governments struggle to admit the importance of these regions for the energy transition. That's the first question we're having here. And the second question is how to solve the dilemma of cross-border offsets developing, where polluting industries in one part of the world are getting greenwashed at their expense on some green measures taken elsewhere in the world, but on which basis the counting is being done is also asked.
I think the first question is easier to answer than the second. The first question, how do we support fossil fuel dependent regions? I mean, this is where national policies are very important. In the case of my country and I think a number of countries, the national policy is to put a price on carbon. The price is about 35 New Zealand dollars a ton of CO2 at present, and that will rise. We'll get some budgets later this year, and we'll see a price to the future. That is a revenue stream from the polluters that central government can decide to spend as it wishes. And I think that this is not just any tax. This is not just business as usual, governments raising money. This is a price to change behavior. And I think it's critically important that governments are very transparent about how they use that. That is a revenue stream that can be used to compensate, to pay for that just transition. And I think that the communication of this is critically important, that we know, across the entire society that we have to change behavior, that it's going to be more expensive to emit carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel combustion, and that the government isn't sitting on some windfall. The government is actually going to direct funds appropriately to assist the transition. And some of the most affected regions should obviously be the biggest beneficiaries of that. And that is, in fact, what the government is doing in my country. The big gas producing region, where there's a lot of expertise built around that industry, is going to have to change. That is a priority for action. On the cross-border offsets, I feel that we're in a much more contentious territory. All I can say is that I have, I think, chaired at least 2 roundtable meetings, and I know that Connie Hedegaard's chaired another 2 on this issue of carbon adjustments at the border. I think the politics of it are obvious. It is the implementation and the detail which is a bit of a nightmare, because such mechanisms can be misused. But I have to say, conceptually, I've got no problem with the notion that we do need to take account at the border of what is happening or not happening abroad. Now, that's where an organization like the OECD is so important, because if you want to play with these sorts of tools, you are potentially playing with fire. And so you need a trusted independent party that can generate rules which can be respected, rules which are enforceable, standards for governments which are not going to be turned into protectionist devices. So I mean, I'm not answering your question. I don't really think it's for me to answer, but as a person who's looked at the issue for a long time, it doesn't ever go away. That we live in a world where we try to gain international cooperation, but on the other hand, where people aren't cooperating, it's almost impossible to say to citizens, well, I'm sorry, but you're going to lose so that somebody's non-cooperation is rewarded. It has to be a two-sided deal. So not a good answer, Rudiger, but I think I'm probably saying what a lot of politicians would like to say, but don't.
Well, thanks a lot, Simon. I mean, I'm most definitely not disputing, I mean, your statement that organizations like the OECD would have an important role in the international coordination to play on these things, maybe also some kind of soft law. Stein, I mean, you had been breaking up, so we moved to the question and answer session, but I wanted to give you the possibility to finish, I mean, your answer, basically.
Yeah, sorry, my connection fell away. I don't know exactly at which moment I fell away. I suddenly noticed that no one reacted at the end of my intervention. So I was talking about the fact that indeed the renovation can give opportunities and job opportunities, but this is not always so easy to grasp these opportunities, because in Flanders we have a lack of skilled workers for the renovation. So that is why this is also a barrier we are trying to tackle. We're investing a lot in education and cooperation with the sector involved, that we find enough skilled workers. And of course, also in the field of innovation, we have many opportunities. And this is also something that we try to grasp with our recovery plan. In our recovery plan, we really believe in the innovation and research to contribute to global climate change. And we foresaw their complementary investments, for example, in the hydrogen economy, which is also very interesting for us, because we have this high energy intensive industrial cluster with our ports, our Flemish ports. So we really believe in this innovation, and hydrogen is there a perfect example of. Also in Flanders, we are very innovative in the field of the circular economy. This is also something we are very proud of. So of course there are many opportunities. We are not blind for this, of course.
Okay, thanks a lot, Stein. I mean, we have a question on more information on Mexico. Maybe Nick, you can say something on that. Maybe you can put a link, or you can maybe post a link in the chat. I mean, that may be the most effective way, but maybe you can say quickly something on Mexico.
Thanks, Rudiger. Very happy to post a link on Mexico. We actually just last week launched a major report with the Mexican government on how Mexico can seize the urban opportunity to support its economic, social, and climate objectives. So I'll post that in the link. I'm also happy to address any of the other questions that have popped up.
We have a question to Flanders. Basically, to what extent is national governance creating risks for fragmented responses with limited scale-up opportunities to address decarbonization? Sorry.
Yeah, I think there the element of subsidiarity is important. The elements that need to be tackled at a higher level of government need to be tackled at this higher level. Like also on innovation, there of course there are a lot of opportunities for scale up, and that's also why we do a lot of things on the European level with the European Innovation Fund, trying to stimulate this at the European scale. But like other things, like really going to the citizens and trying to persuade them to perform renovations. This is something I can imagine is at the perfect place at this local level. So it all depends on what kind of measures you are thinking about. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. We have a last question, which is on sustainable food systems, and also, I guess, to some degree about, I mean, food in cities, urban farming. And I would be very interested in Simon's and Nick's views on that topic, basically, on those two topics. I don't know who wants to start. I mean, Simon, do you want to start?
I think as the cities expert, Nick might actually be able to tell us more.
Okay, Nick, go first.
Yes, I mean, I am by no means a food systems expert at all. But in addressing that question, I think clearly there's three levels. So when it comes to urban areas, clearly urban areas are huge consumers of food. So there's clearly a vast swathe of actions that can be taken by national government in partnership with local government to look at the way that we consume food. I think second, you know, many cities are within the urban realm producers of food, and I think there is a lot more work to be done to look at looking at the production of food within urban centres and urban agriculture, to really look at how do we do so in a way which can reduce carbon footprints as well as support healthier livelihoods. I think the final thing I would say, and the area that we have more expertise and experience in, is there's clearly a very deep connection between agriculture and the process of urbanization in multiple ways. But just one example is when it comes to the question of land use. The world is, on current projections, will add something like the area of New York City every month for the next 4 decades. Urban sprawl continues to be very, very significant and a profound trend, which could be exacerbated by the current pandemic, given the movement that we've seen towards enhanced use of private vehicle travel. And clearly, much of that urban sprawl is taking place on frontier and valuable agricultural land, which creates potential risk for food security in the future, and potentially could have a significant impact on carbon reduction objectives, and certainly in terms of enhancing resilience. So I think across all those three levels, more attention needs to be given to this issue area, but it's not something we've done a lot of work ourselves in. Simon, I know you'll know a lot more about this. Please, over to you.
I just support your observation on that very last point, because there is a real tension. And in my country, it's we have really a collision between a really quite severe demand for housing, and that is, using a traditional development pattern, a demand for more land, and on the other hand, a growing concern about highly productive soil, which often happens to be adjacent to major urban areas. And so what we have now is a national policy to encourage all local and regional governments to give particular priority to avoiding highly productive soils. And on the other hand, we have national policies directing local and regional government to ensure that they can guarantee additional space for housing. And so councils at the local and regional level are really facing something of a challenge to reconcile the two. This is not easy. And the point that if I can add something more into the mix, it's that the traditional answer has been, okay, well, look, let's densify. Let's have more people, let's not cover this good land. But, and I'm doing some research on this point, what's that going to mean for the greenness and the climate resilience of cities? Undeniably, one of the things about relatively low density cities, as we have built them in the New World, is that they're actually very green. There's an awful lot of green in people's gardens, in the berms along the sides of the streets, in parks. And so from a climate point of view, if you're living in a hotter world and a wetter world, that's the sort of built environment that can actually cope. Now, if you then harden it all up, you have many, many more people, you have more concrete, you have more asphalt, you have more heat, you have less in the way of green space, you could potentially end up with a less livable urban environment. Now, those of us who've lived in Paris have seen a city which seems to do rather well at both. I'm always amazed by how leafy Paris is despite the population density, but that didn't happen by accident. And I think there's a real challenge to urban designers that if we're going to try to preserve expansion on high quality soil, to stop the urban sprawl, and that we're going to go for much denser forms, which makes all sorts of good sense in terms of transport infrastructure, in terms of the energy costs of services such as water, sewage, and so on, then we have to co-design with that much more consciously green space to compensate for that density. And I think that very often we are running from crisis to crisis, responding to one issue or another. And that's why we need a more coherent spatial approach. So to pass this on, and it's not new, but New Zealand has finally caught up with the world on this. And the law reform proposal here is now to have formal spatial planning at a very high level to try to rationalize where that expansion happens, where the infrastructure is concentrated. And so far, I haven't heard the green bit and how do we actually leave the green space to be climate friendly and resilient? Because there are many cities in the world I wouldn't want to live in if the temperature was on average 2 degrees higher and the precipitation was twice as intense. They will be very unpleasant places to live if we haven't thought about the ability of cities to absorb what climate will throw at us.
I mean, thanks a lot, Simon. I most definitely agree. I mean, we have been pushing also very much here at the OECD, the idea that urban planning is really important and needs to be much more integrated in with a lot of other disciplines, so going forward. We need to cut here because basically we're running out of time. I'm very sorry for that because it has been a really very interesting discussion. I mean, thank you very much for your time, for your wisdom, for your engagement. And I'm now moving to the last part of this launch. I mean, I'm very, very pleased, extremely pleased to have Flavia Terribile, who is the chair of the OECD Regional Development Policy Committee. For those of you who don't know, the OECD RTPC, Regional Development Policy Committee, is basically the committee under which, under the umbrella of which, under the guidance of which this report has been produced. And so I'm extremely pleased to last but not least, to give to Flavia the floor to make some remarks, some closing remarks today.
Thank you very much, Rudiger, for conceiving this very interesting panel discussion, but also all the OECD Secretariat for this new excellent report. On behalf of the Regional Development Policy Committee, I would like to thank for the valuable contributions the Commissioner Simon Upton. Congratulations for your 37 wedding, Councillor Steen Kakkerberg, Director Nick Godfrey. Thank you very much for bringing your expertise and experience and also in engaging in such a fruitful and constructive exchanges. As underlined by the OECD Secretary General, thank you very much for being here with us, and the Director of CFE, Lamia Kamal Shawi. The pandemic has made the need to change of our course even stronger and more urgent. In this last month, in many European countries, but also in other OECD emerging countries, developing countries, as was underlined in the panel discussion, many instruments, many policy instruments have been deployed to complement the traditional toolbox. The United States and China are committed to cooperating with each other and with other countries to tackle the climate crisis. The United States is considering an ambitious climate plan as part of the recovery package. In the European Union, the joint plan called Next Generation EU will make 750 billion euro in loans and grants available to support reforms and investments undertaken by member states. And at least 37% of these resources have to be invested in projects and initiatives that support climate objectives. So this represents an extraordinary opportunity to speed up the recovery, to address inequalities and territorial disparities, and to also to reinforce the commitment to move to net zero emissions. As underlined by all our panelists, while these challenges are global and require an effective multilateral action, the design and implementation of policies and measures needs to build on regional and local actors. The examples illustrated in the panel discussion were all very interesting, also for other regions and cities. Indeed, regional and local government play a key role in crucial sectors for climate actions, including local infrastructure, mobility, transportation, waste management, land use, urban planning. The maps, the figures of the regional outlook show that regions within countries differ hugely in greenhouse gas emissions and also on the vulnerability to climate change. Therefore, regional and local authorities are really well positioned to implement locally tailored climate policies and strategies in line with national and global objectives. But effective multi-level governance systems are needed to align regional and local investment programming with national and international targets. There is a strong need today to work across levels of government, territorial scales, policy sectors, and also to engage in new forms of collaboration with local communities, with research and universities, institutes, with the business and civil society. As was highlighted in the panel discussion, this also increases pressure for transparency, accountability, as well as program evaluation and monitoring. The OECD Secretary General underlined that one major factor today is the social and territorial dimension of climate change. Both the differentiated impacts of climate change on societies and localities, but as well as those that result from the policies implemented to address it. So there is an important theme of equality and territorial distribution of costs and benefits, as was also underlined by Lamia and by Simon Upton. As the regional outlook shows, the impacts of climate change adversely affect disadvantaged groups and vulnerable local communities. The net zero transition can have a significant impact on certain categories of low-skilled workers, sectors, and fragile territories. We therefore need, as Lamia said, a just transition. Climate action is an extraordinary opportunity for our economies, but we need to equally distribute these opportunities in terms of investments, innovation, new markets, and jobs across groups, across local communities and geographies. So here comes the place-based approach with the system of multi-level government that characterizes it, that can secure a broad engagement and also support policy coherence. Italy, as you know, this year in 2021 holds the presidency of the G20. The UK will be assuming the COP26 presidency in partnership with Italy. So many international events will take place over the course of this year. 6 years on from the Paris Agreement, the recovery from the pandemic, I think, offers a unique opportunity to reinforce the multilateral agenda commitment to fight climate change, but also to make its social and territorial consequences more salient than ever. So thank you very much again for your time, for your active participation, for your valuable insights. And again, for all RDPC delegates, we will now join our meeting at 1 o'clock on another specific registration. Thank you very much to the Secretary General, Lamia, for being here until the end. This means that the discussion was really interesting, and see you in 2 minutes time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I mean, it was really fascinating seminar. Thank you very much, Flavia, for this for this really nice remarks of drawing it all together. And I was very honored that the Secretary General stayed all through the meeting. Thank you also very much, Lamia, for your excellent presentations, and all the panelists for the fantastic contributions, and also to the audience for really interesting questions and your patience. Goodbye, everybody, and thank you.